Welcome to week 2 of Armenia and Azerbaijan at war. This is week 2 of the conversations by the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies, conversations with scholars and analysts trying to understand what is happening in the region. It's week 2 of the talking. It's week 3 of the actual fighting in the region. Fighting, tragic, disastrous, irretrievable 3 weeks, really, that are going to change the lives of peoples in the region, and I don't think it's hyperbole to say in the world. Between last week and this week, a ceasefire was negotiated and never implemented. The sides continue to fight. Azerbaijan continues to push further into Karabakh. The Armenians continue to push back. I was going to say shelling on Stepanakert, the capital of Karabakh, Artsakh, has diminished, except that it just started up again a few minutes ago. And the international media, fortunately, continues to come to the region to try to better understand and explain a very complex situation. Information from within Azerbaijan remains spotty, and really only just from official sources. What is clear, however, is that there is a new hunger, I'm afraid to say readiness, but something for a conversation between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, analysts, scholars, activists, and that's something that we feel a responsibility to try to take on, but need to do so carefully in a way that works for everyone involved. Today's conversation is about powerhouse neighbors. Armenia has several. Today's conversation is about 2 of them, Turkey and Iran. There's my mistake. Today's conversation is about Turkey and Russia. We are not going to be speaking about Iran, as important as that conversation is. That will be a part of today's back and forth. We're talking about Russia and Turkey and their both actual and potential roles in the situation on the ground today, and their roles in the prospects for peace. We'll start, as we did last week, with the situation on the ground, this time from a different perspective, from the perspective of the media. Arutunyan is editor-in-chief of CivilNet AM, a bilingual, sometimes tri- and quadrilingual news site where necessary, where the motto is not what, but why. CivilNet's reporters have been on the ground in Karabakh, near the front, under the shelling, in Goris. That's the first and the last piece of Armenia on the way into and out of Karabakh. We're going to speak to my former colleague, Garin, about all of this. And on top of it all, he found out this morning that he has COVID. Now, fortunately, he's on his way down, not on his way up. And so we're glad he's here. Garin, you don't look very flushed, so I hope you're feeling as good as you look.
I'm fine. The war is much worse than COVID.
The war is much worse than COVID. There's a line for you. Garinjan, let's talk about what the CivilNet team is reporting from the zones of fighting. What were the stories you heard today?
You know that this year we established an office in Stepanakert 2 months before the war started in July. And the original idea, the initial idea was to cover Karabakh, not just war and peace, but Karabakh, ordinary people, how they live, what they think, what are their everyday problems, etc., so that people see that Karabakh is not just conflict, but it's a place where people have all the problems that all other peoples have in other corners of the world. But unfortunately, this war changed the topic radically. We again started to talk about war, unfortunately about war for the moment, not peace.
They're in Stepanakert, the staff?
We have a staff of 2. We set up a small studio to have interviews, etc., like we did here in Yerevan.
And
to
what are they
promote
saying today?
Lika, our reporter, is working alone because the other guy, the video man, the cameraman, and the video editor was summoned to army. Now Lika has to work alone.
So Lika is the young woman, the reporter, who's also doing a lot of
Yes.
writing in English, and Levon, the cameraman, is at the front. What was the situation in Stepanakert today, and what's the situation in Goris?
Situation in Stepanakert was calmer today before just several minutes, and they again started shelling the city. And in Goris is sort of a transformation point, a transferring point for wounded people, for and not only for cargoes,
What's the conversation? What is the media in Armenia talking about? Are they talking about victory? Are they talking about compromise? Are we talking about peace? It's hard with bodies coming home every day to talk about peace and compromise. I understand the absurdity maybe of the question, but I also know that that's a very important question.
Unfortunately, not much conversation about peace, and this is normal, and this is also the result of the war and the lack of proper public discourse on peace and war that could precede this, that could prevent this. In both societies, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, the conversation about peace was not popular, is not popular. Nobody was going to discuss peace.
How is international media being read in Armenia? Let's start with the Russian media. What is the Russian media saying, and what is the Armenian media picking up from Russia?
So the Russian media, how they cover, is very much conditioned by the official position of the Russian government. So the Russian position, the Russian media coverage is very much in favor of Armenia. For example, especially after the incident with Russian journalists in the Shushi church, and also you can see this talk shows on the Russian.
What was the incident?
The guy was wounded during the strike of the Shushi Khazan Chetsos church during the second strike.
A Russian journalist.
Yes, a Russian journal. Yes. So, and the Russian media, the coverage of the Russian media is very much conditioned by the official and unofficial policies of the Kremlin. And you can watch all these talk shows on the Russian channels, slamming Turkey, criticizing their policies, etc. It's very much in favor of Armenia, but of course they promote their interests. But there are several Russian media outlets, for example, Dosh, which strangely took a very pro-Azeri position. Dosh, which is considered to be a liberal and free media. So their coverage was very biased.
Biased or one-sided?
One-sided. For example, they were covering the shelling of Barda and other cities, Azerbaijani cities around Nagorno-Karabakh, and not Stepanakert itself. So it was one-sided, yes.
The Turkish media is not read as much in Armenia, language reasons and other reasons, but reports from Turkish media are often reproduced in the Armenian media. Is there some of that happening?
It can happen, but we are more careful now, and the Armenian media outlets too, I think, in this martial law situation when there are certain restrictions on the media coverage, etc. And there is this general mood of anti-Turkishness, anti-Azerbaijaniness. So media outlets are, I think, much more delicate about what to pick up from the Turkish media, but it depends.
Garen, you have lived in Karabakh. Your wife is from Karabakh. What are you hearing from people on the ground? Who's staying with you now in your home with your two boys?
Yeah, so many relatives have come to Armenia, and my father-in-law is settled here at my house. And it's so much personal about Karabakh. I've lived there. My grandparent is actually from Karabakh. He was born in Talish. I haven't seen him. He was killed in the Second World War. And it's interesting times that we live in. For the first time, I would say, after 1988, it is the first time that the Armenian and Karabakhi societies are coming so much close together. They are sort of converging. And during all these 30 years, the elites of the two societies have converged, but the societies remained separate. So 70,000 people from Artsakh have settled in Armenia. This is huge. And many, many people in Armenia have understanding about Karabakhis from the TVs, etc. No personal experience of dealing with the ordinary Karabakh people, and vice versa. So this is going to be a very big impetus for a real unity, I think.
I don't know if I want to ask this question. It's a question that needs to be asked for all sides. And that is, with now the second or the third generation, depending on how we want to count, being directly, personally impacted by actual military conflict, what is going to be the process of democratization, economic development? How, if, when are these societies going to be able, let's speak about Armenia obviously, to be able to come back to that path now that there is another generation that is wounded?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult. I don't know.
Is that even Is that even a conversation? That how do you
It's not a part of a conversation at the moment. Nobody is talking about democratization at the moment. There are certain restrictions during this martial law. There is this huge national unity now to win the war, and no much talk about democracy, no much talk about the future of the country and many other issues. But I think we'll come back to this soon.
Is there an expectation that the fighting will stop when Russia says it will stop? Or is the expectation that the fighting will stop when somebody wins?
At the beginning of the war, there was an expectation that Russia can interfere and stop the hostilities. But with the continuation of the war, it is becoming less predictable because the role that Russia plays and the role that Turkey plays are totally different roles. Russia is the leading mediator at the OSCE Minsk group, and interfering in the conflict directly and overtly will kick her off from the process as an arbiter, as a mediator. Unlike Turkey, which sided itself with Azerbaijan and supports Azerbaijan with all means, political, military, and others. So Russia is playing a very subtle game. On one hand, it's very uneasy about Turkish interference and involvement to its proximities in this region. On the other hand, it cannot behave and act like Turkey does. But we can see Russia's reactions on other spheres, like, for example, On October 5, Russia, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, replaced the head of Dagestan and appointed a general from deputy head of Rosgvardia, which is the domestic forces in Russia. And also Russia hit the Syrian mercenaries in Idlib, and they started a huge military drills in the Caspian Sea. And today Erdogan received Ukraine's president Vladimir Zelensky, and they said that Turkey supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemns Crimea's annexation, etc. So Russia sees all these Turkish movements, Turkish rhetoric, etc., and cannot just stand and watch how Turkey is strengthening its positions in the South Caucasus. But again, it's very difficult for Russia to act like Turkey, to directly interfere into the conflict.
That's a perfect introduction to our next guests. Garen Arutunyan, editor-in-chief of civilnet.am, in Armenia, bilingual, trilingual news site. My former colleague. First, get well, and second, be safe, and third, hugs to everyone. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Salpi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Garen. So joining me for the rest of today's conversation is going to be Emil Sanamyan. Emil joined us last week, and he'll join us again next week. Emil is the editor of the Institute's Focus on Karabakh portal, and he writes on politics and security in the Caucasus and the wider neighborhood. His articles have appeared in a myriad publications. He was born in then Soviet Baku. He is the authority, the go-to guy on military developments of these 30 years and information on a broad range of perspectives on this conflict. So I welcome Emil always. And also today joining us are Anna Arutunyan, who is an independent Russia analyst and writer. She has written 3 books on Russia, including The Putin Mystique, and has covered Russia and its foreign policy for a number of publications around the world. She was born in Moscow. She is multi-continental. She's speaking with us today from London, but lives in Moscow or Washington, D.C., or who knows where at various times. Anna, welcome.
Thank you.
And Professor Robert English, our friend at the USC Department of Political Science and International Relations, down the hall from the Institute of Armenian Studies. Rob English is a historian and international relations scholar. He was at one time head of the School of International Relations at USC. He specializes in the history and politics of contemporary Eastern Europe, Russia, and of course the USSR. He has amazing capacity to remember and contextualize all of the consequential events that have taken place in the post-Soviet space in these 3 decades. So he, together with Anna, will help Emil and I understand and explain several things. One, whether friend or foe, which is what we titled this program, is even the right question. And 2, how do we understand Russia and Russia's moves in the context of Armenian expectations and the understandings of the West. So this is just kind of the general umbrella under which we'll be speaking. And I think perhaps we start with Rob giving us a bit of the context about how Russian attitudes, no, instead let's do this. Before I ask Rob to give us the context of Russian attitudes, let me ask Emil to talk about what the actual binding agreements between Russia and Armenia even are. What can legitimately be expected from Russia before I ask Rob to put these expectations and the general attitudes in context?
Greetings, everybody. Armenia and Russia have a series of agreements. Most recently, they were updated about 10 years ago, I want to say, maybe 12 in that time frame. Shortly after 10 years ago, shortly after the normalization process with Turkey faltered. the Armenian government decided to renew the treaty, extend the Russian military presence to 2044 at Gyumri. What had
And everyone
changed?
was shocked that it was for such a long period.
Yeah, but I mean, it was in line with sort of other base right renewals that Russian government was doing in Central Asia and also in some of the other areas. As part of that treaty, Russia agreed to transfer some defense articles to Armenia, and they did. They also upgraded their own base in Armenia, which was pretty had pretty antiquated equipment at that time. There was also a change in the way countries would sort of the overall mission of the base. If in the past the Russian military presence was about sort of clearly pursuing Russian interest, the new language talked about Armenia's security and sort of focused on sort of bilateral interest, coinciding interest. We heard from Vladimir Putin the other day that Russian obligations concern Republic of Armenia territory only. They do not concern the territory of an Artsakh Republic or Nagorno-Karabakh. That's where the duality of the position is. Obviously, the fighting is so far concentrated in Artsakh, and Russian position has been for coming back to ceasefire in Artsakh rather than sort of triggering any direct involvement by Russia militarily on Armenia's behalf. Even though there have been some attacks inside Republic of Armenia territory, but they happened in the past as well. Those things don't automatically trigger military intervention. For that military intervention to take place, there has to be some kind of political rationale
Sure.
that the Russian government would pursue.
And that's something we're going to talk about next week, the continuation of the situation in Davush in the northeastern corner of Armenia. Professor Rob English, you've been following this for the 30 years that it's been happening. You were there in the early 90s, yeah? And tell us how Russian attitudes have evolved, not policy necessarily, but attitudes. And then with Anna, we'll get into policy.
Yes, because if we think that public opinion in Russia matters, and I think it does, that Putin is very mindful of his elite and general public opinion on questions of international relations, then we want to pay attention to that. And I won't go back to the 90s. I'll go back to the mid and late 80s, right, the high perestroika years. And I lived in Moscow all through that time until the end of 91. And it's notable that at that time, right, perestroika came into full bloom, democratization, national movements, and of course, the Karabakh issue burst out after the massacres in Stepanakert in 1988. And what I recall, at the risk of romanticizing it, is tremendous sympathy on the part of at least Muscovites and Leningraders, right? Educated urban Russians for Armenia. It was deep, it was heartfelt, it was reflexive. There was a sense of historic kinship. This is a people with whom we've fought together, we've prayed together for centuries. The Armenian elite, intellectual and political, was always overrepresented. Gorbachev's own advisors, from Shakhnazarov to Agabekyan, Sergei Parajanov, culturally Armenian contributions to cultural life were enormous. And then when this happened, it was reflexive, right, that Russians sided with Armenians, and nothing encapsulated that better than the most heroic intellectual figure, political intellectual figure, would be Andrei Sakharov, the human rights champion, as well as physicist, who immediately embraced the Armenian cause in those years of massacre and violence. And so there was a really strong bond in the Soviet generation. And what I fear is that that's mostly gone now. It's gone because of decades of cynicism, of economic difficulty. It's gone partly because Armenia has lost the role of the underdog because it succeeded in the early 90s, by and large, at least temporarily. And it's also gone because politics in Russia is so deeply cynical under Vladimir Putin and transactional. So issues of principle and historic justice have faded. And it's sort of, what can you do for me? And so Armenians are maybe troublemakers. They're drawing us into a conflict we'd rather avoid. Who are they? Do we really owe them what you think we do? I'm worried that Russian public opinion has soured in this way.
Although what Garin just said was that Russian media generally has been positive. Of course, the question is the way in which that's packaged and presented, and to what extent that actually could or might translate into policy. And, you know, the constant fear here is that often, and everyone in the world does this, and Armenians particularly, in that we define international relations in terms of kinship and friendship. You know, is Russia Armenians' historic friend, as opposed to what does Russia have on its plate right now today with which countries, and how does this particular calculus fit into that? And that's part of this whole Kremlin policy issue. So Anna, welcome. Let's talk about Kremlin policy.
Hi, Salpi, it's great to be here. Great to see everybody. I think there's a very serious difficulty when it comes to Russia's relations with Turkey. And unfortunately, in this conflict, that has become clearly a serious thing. Now, the question of, you know, friend or foe, there's a tendency to think in those binaries. And I think when it comes to Turkey, it's both and neither.
Well, let's just for the two people who may be watching who don't quite know why we took such a fast leap to Turkey, and that's because Turkey has very overtly, in this go-round, both militarily, diplomatically, public relations, been an active supporter of Azerbaijan, and in fact, vocally, in many ways, much more bellicose and...
The participant.
Go on, Emil.
Not just a supporter, but a participant of the war.
And in that context, then, now the Russia-Armenia relationship, the bilateral, isn't just a bilateral question anymore, and Turkey is a part of this. So, Anna, I interrupted, please.
So it's a very, from Russia's standpoint, what it can and what it should do with regards to supporting Armenia, which is a traditional ally and which it is under obligation to support, is hampered and limited by this far more complicated relationship with Turkey, which is neither a friend or a foe, and also in some ways both. I mean, I would call them frenemies, really, and this is as they've been called before. And if we look at the way that Russia and Turkey interact on a number of conflicts where they are on opposing sides, like Syria or Libya, it is once there's always a threat of confrontation, but at the same time it's a very pragmatic relationship where the two leaders always meet and decide something behind the scenes. The question of whether that something works or not, that's a different issue, and oftentimes it doesn't, as we've seen in Syria. But I think that this is the main issue, that Russia's options when it comes to doing more for Armenia are complicated and limited by the fact that it does not want to risk a confrontation with Turkey, and the fact that it does not want to alienate Azerbaijan. And the importance of these things, I think it's often underestimated to what extent Russia's foreign policy is essentially stands on balancing and leveraging its relations with a whole assortment of different players, both in its near abroad and further beyond. There have been calls that Russia should use its relationship with Ankara to put more pressure on Turkey. I agree, and at the same time, I see just how limited its options are based on how it's, how previous agreements with Turkey have gone.
Emil, you want to weigh in before I ask Rob what those options may be?
Yeah, the relationship is a very complicated one. Basically, Russia and Turkey have been in a proxy war in Syria over the past number of years, and more recently also in proxy war in Libya. But at the same time, since both Russia and Turkey are primarily focused on challenging the West and challenging, their primary focus is on sort of that confrontational relationship with Europeans and the United States, they kind of find useful to support each other, to keep each other's back in a sense, as they're both challenging the West. So we have to look at, realize that the primary focus is West rather than on each other, and both Erdogan and Putin being in a way similar type of leaders also brings them together in this kind of solidarity of billionaire authoritarians or whatever described.
Rob, can we bring this down to the granular level? Because I think that even though people can follow exactly what Anna and Emil just said, Libya, Syria, all of these other considerations, it's very difficult to imagine what goes on behind the scenes as these world leaders meet. In other words, do they sit down and say, yeah, I know you and I have Syria and Libya issues, but let's see, what are we really going to do with Armenia and Azerbaijan? Or are there several pieces on the table and they say, if you're coming into my backyard here, you can't say anything about my coming into your backyard there. The granular mechanisms, please.
I'm flattered that I'm very flattered you think I can answer that I have sources at the table or on the wall, so to speak.
Even examples.
I would say I'm not sure this is a satisfactory answer, because we know that Putin and Erdogan had a phone call the other day. Of course, Putin has spoken much more with Pashinyan and the Armenian side, but presumably even if a short call with Erdogan only could cover some big issues, at the working level, as you say, the trade-offs, the way it impacts your economically, militarily, Libya, Syria, gas pipelines is all present. But what I wanted to do was ask all three of you a question, which is, so far our discussion of Russia's perspective, Russia's complications and constraints here suggests that Russia is constrained. But we haven't explored the thesis, which is also propounded by a lot of Russian analysts, security analysts, think tank types, that, how to put it, that Russia is not unhappy to see Armenia suffer a modest, not complete defeat in this, because Putin is said to be very impatient with Armenian intransigence, as he sees it on Karabakh, the failure to at least give some compromise to date. He's also obviously irritated with the democratic Western tilt of the Velvet Revolution and the new government. And the argument is, he's allowing this to happen. He's not only constrained, but Armenia being taught a lesson and pushed back and being forced to give up some territory. He won't let it be a total collapse, any humanitarian disaster. But he's not only constrained, he's allowing this to happen. I don't know that that's true because I don't have people at the table, but there's good evidence that that's part of Putin's thinking as well.
Emil, what do you think?
Well, I would separate those two notions there. The one that Putin is unhappy with Armenian intransigence on Karabakh. I've never seen any evidence of that. As a matter of fact, what I've seen the evidence of is Putin's recognition of the complexity of the problem and difficulty of resolving it through a compromise. So in a sense, Putin seems to appreciate the Armenian position on Karabakh, and that's in a way supported also by Putin playing up his relationship with the former president of Armenia, Robert Kocharian, who is best known as the former leader of Karabakh as well. On the other hand, there's definitely dissatisfaction with the current leader of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, and there is definitely a sense that he wants Pashinyan to appeal for his help and to show basically the world that even though this is he might be a revolutionary leader or democratically elected, he will come around and respect the rules of that particular region, and of course, Pashinyan has tried to have a normal relationship with Putin. He tried to make it clear that he doesn't want to change Armenia's foreign policy orientation, that his priority is about making amends domestically for 20 or many years of democratic shortfalls and injustices, etc. But at the same time, he did take steps that were obviously, steps that were intended to irritate Putin. Raiding all of the Russian companies that have offices in Armenia, from the railroads to the electricity, etc. So, and of course, jailing Kocharyan, jailing the former general secretary of CSTO. All of those things have accumulated to a point where, for essentially 4 or 5 months before this war, there was not a channel between Pashinyan and Putin. At least there were no reports of them talking on the phone or meeting or anything like that. So that definitely created this opening, or at least contributed to the creation of this opening that Erdogan and Aliyev are exploiting right now. And I will agree with Rob on that second point that, up until now, Pashinyan has not asked for Putin's help, and essentially said that, we appreciate their efforts for ceasefire. So if there is no ask from Armenia, it's easier for Putin not to answer. Of course, the answer is not simple. The answer would be complicated, and I'd love to hear Anna's
Absolutely.
take as well.
Anna, what do you think?
I think this is it's a very, very complicated question. I think there are different ways of looking at it. I agree. I agree with all of you, actually, but at the same time, I do want to caution that I think from the standpoint of the Kremlin, it's not so much that they really care whether a country in its periphery has turned democratic. Putin cares more precisely about this loyalty factor. And I agree that that he is irritated, not so much by by any sort of democratic leanings. I mean, for all we know, Putin could consider himself a Democrat, under his own ideas of what democracy is. He doesn't really care. What he cares about is assurances of loyalty and assurances of Armenia not leaning towards the West, not playing any sort of zero-sum games. Now, I don't think that in particular is a problem. I think that the irritation comes from more granular issues, as Emil was talking about. But I think that the question, back to the question of whether he is trying to teach Armenia a lesson, I mean, based on how I see the Kremlin operating, Putin can be vindictive. I don't think that this is that case. I think that it's more about allowing, in the sense of it is not worth his while at this stage, at this point in time, to do more. Whether that's because of irritation, whether that's because there are other factors and other limitations that are keeping the Kremlin's hands tied.
Rob, let's open that up. Let's open that up. The constraints, the limitations, you've all referred to them. What are they? What is he juggling?
In the first place, I'm fascinated. Does Russian public opinion matter much here? And if so, how? Is there a fear that Russia could be drawn into a military role at a time when Russia's overextended and people are sick of foreign entanglements? Or is there a fear that or even an attempt somehow to worry about sympathy, right? Back in the late 80s and early 90s, I think it's very, very much the case that the strong Russian sympathy, as I say, reflexive, historic of that generation for Armenia, very strongly conditioned Yeltsin's government to act as it did in the early 90s. Don't forget, Sakharov and Yeltsin were partners in the interregional group of deputies from way back, right? Yeltsin was steeped in that ethos regarding Russia and Armenia. Does it matter anymore that that has weakened, what is the impact of the pro-Armenian coverage on Russian television? Or am I worrying about something that's only a fourth-order concern in any case, that Putin doesn't worry about Russian public opinion, not in a foreign entanglement, not a historic sympathy, not in response to a massacre, nothing? Maybe I'm overrating that altogether.
Well,
I don't know.
Emil, talk to that, because I really think for people sitting at home who know that Armenia has in the past, rightly or wrongly, dependent on Russia, Russia has in the past, justly or unjustly, come in to these ongoing regional issues. Open this up for people on the ground. What are the things that the Kremlin is probably taking into consideration as it possibly thinks about intervening?
Well, certainly, like I said earlier, any intervention would be a complicated matter. From perspective of foreign policy entanglements that Russia has with Turkey and Azerbaijan, they already have plenty of enemies. They don't want to become direct enemies. Also, from purely technical aspect of it, Armenia is not geographically contiguous to Russia, so
exactly. So what does that mean?
That means currently for Russians to move material to Armenia, and you have to also remember the unresolved nature of Russian-Georgian relations and the inability of Russia to fly over Georgian territory. Russian material is moved via Caspian and Iran into Armenia. And we didn't touch on Iran much, but there's been pressure on Iran, inside Iran, to also side with Azerbaijan in this conflict. And today, as a matter of fact, Ilham Aliyev claimed that Iran had restricted or limited, the weapons supplies into Armenia. I don't know if it's true or not, but certainly they're trying to push that and try to, basically isolate Armenia.
And Georgia has already said that that is limited.
Right. In Georgia, I mean, up until now, Armenia was able to move anything it wanted by its own planes via Georgia. There were no limits on Armenia, but there might be limits now because obviously Georgia is also under pressure. So there is this geographic complexity of the region that makes it difficult for Russians to actually deploy. And going back to the recent exercises that they had Caucasus 2020, the Russian exercises. Their plan is basically to, in case of big need in Armenia, is to deploy an airborne brigade into Armenia by airdropping people, because there's not enough of an infrastructure in Armenia just to there might be a time factor also, and also they were planning things like an amphibious assault on Azerbaijan from the Caspian coast. So that creates an additional level of complexity that say didn't exist in Russian intervention in Georgia in 2008, where they had first of all small but politically important peacekeeping presence in both places. In South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and also they had contiguous borders where they could just directly deploy without having to worry, move material and move to, move people around, circuitous route with Iran.
To what extent is the proxy war in Syria going to become a factor in determining who stays and who goes from the Caucasus region, Rob?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear Salpi say again. To what extent will the
fact that Turkey and Russia are both in Syria through their representatives, to what extent is that going to impact the way the Caucasus interactions between Russia and Turkey may be determined? Is it a trade-off?
I think just as Anna, no, I don't think so. It's a complication. Just as Anna already said, we have them supporting opposing sides in Syria, in Libya. A relationship that has strong economic ties and a sort of partnership in opposing NATO and the West, and so much irritation with Europe. So they have commonalities, they have conflicting interests. It just makes it damned complicated when they come to try to work this out. I'm still unclear. I'm still a little, I guess I'm going to push back both on what Emil and Anna are saying. I still see that Russia could, with a bold stroke, regardless of the logistic complications, we're not talking about moving 5 divisions, right? We're talking about moving a brigade to immediately impact this conflict. And Russia's feeling constrained because of whether it's Iran's role, not wanting to upset the cart with Erdogan and Turkey. At some point, Russia is losing so much prestige and permitting another great power to suddenly be the power broker in its own backyard, that it's going to act. And again, my suspicion was it's going to act when, it has to, and Armenia will have ceded some territory, lost some territory, at least adjoining Karabakh or part of Karabakh, and there'll be another ceasefire, and Russia will step back in, to resume its role as the main power broker, and the timidity we see, what I guess I'm saying is the timidity we see, not wanting to upset Turkey, and that this is also complicated and constraining, could be wiped away in one stroke, and then there'll be a new balance restored, and probably Turkey and Russia resume business as usual. I don't want to say they're orchestrating this, but Russia looks weak until it acts, and then suddenly it's not, and we've seen that again and again.
There are a couple of lines. One line is from Gorchakov, where Russia is not upset. Russia is concentrating, and the other line is, Russians harness the horse slowly, but then they ride fast. So that's very much typical Russian MO to kind of gather itself.
Yeah, that was going to be my last question to you, Rob, is exactly that Russian self-image question, because at the end of the day, Anna, is it still, with all of the distraction, Belarus, Ukraine, all of the distraction, Russia still wants to be that power, and they're the ones who are going to have to be the ones who appear to come in with some sort of mediating capacity, right? That still matters.
Well, yes. I think when we talk about constraints, when we talk about Russia's hands being tied, I do want to stress that there is also the constraint of Russia's own will. In other words, yes, absolutely, there are things that Russia can do that it doesn't want to do. It's weighing all of these constraints against its own will, against how much it feels that it's worth its while to do more. And I think that is there are these issues of prestige, but I think that there is, if we look back at cases when the Kremlin has acted decisively in its foreign policy and its foreign adventures, we often tend to overestimate its capacity for willful action like that. And while I do think that absolutely public opinion does matter to the Kremlin, and the semblance of supporting Armenia does matter to the Kremlin, at the same time, if we look back, alas, the Kremlin acts decisively when it feels threatened. It acted decisively when it felt threatened in the case of Georgia, and it acted decisively when it felt threatened in the case of Ukraine. Now, whether or not that threat is actually real or perceived, that's a different matter. But the point is, as long as we've got conflicts on Russia's periphery, as long as we've got instability on Russia's periphery that it doesn't feel directly and existentially threatened by, the Kremlin's modus operandi has been to just kind of balance everything out and cite constraints and really not do much. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
What you've all succeeded to do is to further underline the complexity of this mess. And I'm grateful for that, because it really is complex, because searching for the simple answers is just going to get everyone in deep trouble. So thank you for trying to wade through this matter. And now, to further complicate things, even as I thank Anna Arutunyan and Professor Robert English for joining us and saying goodbye, I'm going to welcome an old friend, Cengiz Çandar, who is one of Turkey's top journalists. Turkey, to its credit, still has journalism, even though awfully constrained these days. And journalists are respected celebrities, and Cengiz Çandar is one of those who's been a journalist for many decades, and in fact was one of the journalists who was in Armenia when President Abdullah Gül of Turkey came to Armenia, what seems now like a century ago, in the days when it appeared that things might slowly begin to change between not just Armenians and Turks, but official Ankara and official Yerevan. That's when I met Cengiz, and he came and he stayed and he tried to understand the lay of the land. Prior to that, he had worked for a long time in Lebanon, and so his experience with Armenians was also in the diaspora. And finally, of course, he is from Istanbul, a friend of Hrant Dink's, and a member of that segment of Turkish society that saw that that might be an opening to, in fact, introduce greater rights and democracies and understandings in Turkey itself. I've now given a very personal introduction instead of telling you that he is the author of 7 books in Turkish, mainly on Middle East issues. He is a distinguished visiting scholar at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies and a senior associate fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. In other words, he is also one of those public intellectuals of Turkey who no longer lives in Turkey. Cengiz, I know I must have left a great deal out, but welcome.
Thank you. And if you allow me just to make very
please, I was going to ask you. Oh, please do.
One about tense. I was a journalist. I'm not a journalist anymore. It ceased 4 years ago, and there is no more free journalism in Turkey. It's over. So thanks not to me or not anybody else that it exists, other than social media, which is under strict restrictions and control. And secondly, when we had met prior to the former President Gül's visit to Yerevan, it was the first time 2 of us had met, but I had been to Armenia in the mid-90s when Ter-Petrosyan was president, and at the turn of the century, it was the year 2001, I think, I have also been to Karabakh. Therefore, I'm aware of the topography and the territory of the disputed areas or the places of our subject matter right now. So these are the minor additions, insertions, or corrections that I wanted to make.
I accept them with pleasure, and I should also say you do occasionally write for Al Monitor, the Turkey Pulse portal of Al Monitor. Cengiz, do you want to start by commenting on any of the things you've heard, or shall we?
Yeah, just briefly, when I was listening carefully, all the interlocutors, I felt that there is too much emphasis, kind of overemphasis on the divergences and conflicts between Turkey and Russia in Syria and elsewhere. And you, for example, underlined that the proxy war in Syria, that Turkey and Russia are supporting different sides, which is correct. But at the same time, I think we have to take into consideration that the commonalities are as important as the divergences between these two players in the region. We have to take in regard that Turkey and Russia have joint patrols in Idlib and also in northeastern Syria. So the men under uniform, Turkish and Russian, are patrolling in the Kurdish areas along the border, according to the deal reached in Sochi about a year ago in October, and the Turks were not satisfied. Erdogan was not satisfied with the deal reached with the Americans, who had, in a sense, had sold out the Kurds at the time. But the deal that he had reached with Putin after a very long talks, which culminated in joint patrolling in the northeastern part of Syria, and now in Idlib after the debacle we had witnessed in March 2020. So there are joint patrols between the two countries, and and the Turks are buying that boat. They did buy S-400 air defense missile systems. The Russian with $2.5 billion without any cost for the Russian lobbying for that. Even Turkey paid even more to the Russians for that. So it created wedges within NATO, within the Western security system. And
so you're saying that
are constructing a nuclear terminal, nuclear power plant in Turkey.
Talk about the nuclear power plant, please.
Yeah,
talk about what that.
It has paramount importance for Turkey's vision for the future in terms of meeting its energy.
And Russia is both building it and partly owns it.
Yes, that's right. But as important as it is, this air defense systems, which created so big problems not only between Turkey and the NATO allies, Turkey and some members of the European Union, but between Turkey and the United States. If the relationship between Turkey and United States still holds, it is thanks to personal rapport between the two presidents, between Erdogan and Trump. If Trump loses the elections, even if he wins, would it be as enthusiastic as guarding Erdogan's interests as he did in his first term, because he will not be re-elected even if he gets elected, that he will be running for the second term. So these are open to questions. And Russia, in that sense, wants to keep Turkey as much. It is a useful instrument to create wedges and chasms within the Western system. So it is dear to Russia in that sense.
So, Emil, if we hear this approach to the Russia-Turkey relationship, that there are plenty of open channels, lots of commonalities, lots of already established collaboration processes, interdependencies, then how do we look at Turkey's presence now, both militarily and, of course, in the resolution process to come? What questions do we now ask about what this means?
Well, we need to get a better understanding as to what extent Erdogan had communicated his plans to Putin, because we know before dispatch of Turkish forces into Azerbaijan in July, there was a conversation between Erdogan and Putin. Obviously, we don't know the extent to which what exactly was communicated, whether he was sort of trying to present this as a temporary deployment for the exercises, and then something changed along the way. What we know is that they had another conversation just a few days ago for the first time since the start of the war on September 27, and that conversation, it appears, was focused on, again, limiting Turkish role in the war. So we need to get a little bit of a better understanding whether what Erdogan had communicated to Putin, whether that had been violated in some ways, in terms of the extent of Turkish involvement, the duration of Turkish involvement, and whether that is going to cause some kind of counteraction from the Russian side. What we have seen in Syria is that, obviously, when you have all of this extensive relationship, trade relationship, military cooperation, etc., both countries see the value of limiting whatever confrontations they engage in. However, we saw how after this extensive Russian military involvement in Syria, Turkey was very concerned about that, and you had the shutdown of the Russian plane, sort of the cripple Russian position a little bit, and then sanctions over that and all those things back in 2016. So that one does not rule out the other. If the Russians feel like they've been that the Turks have come in way heavier than they expected, that there would be some kind of counteraction to limit that.
Cengiz, there's all sorts of speculation about Turkey's motivation. Some people are very quick to slam on the 19th, 20th century term pan-Turanism. Of course, Turkey's imperial or regional global aspirations, the sometimes reference to genocide and continuing what was not completed, all of those are easily tossed around. And of course, Turkey's domestic situation, Erdogan's need for domestic legitimacy, the disastrous economic situation, all of this are listed. Where do we begin to untangle that? How do we prioritize it? What motivates this sort of engagement, knowing it comes with a lot of baggage?
Well, I think that we should understand one thing very clearly. The regime in Turkey, in the domestic sense, it's a very repressive regime. It's an autocracy, not a democracy. So it's an autocratic regime. But what is the color? What is the ideology of this regime? This regime is a very nationalist regime. It's actually an ultra-nationalist regime. It's not only Erdogan. It's a coalition of Erdogan with the arch-nationalists represented by Devlet Bahçeli, who is for 2 decades he is the chairman, or even more than 2 decades, the chairman of the Nationalist Action Party, this rabidly kind of racist nationalist, Turkish nationalist party. So they have a very solid alliance, and if you just disentangle this coalition, if you take Bahçeli out, then the power of Erdogan may collapse, or vice versa. So this is
a domestic basis.
It has a very strong domestic basis with some elements what in the international press we used to hear about deep state, which is the Turkish former militaristic and the civilian bureaucracy with the ideological background to unionist government at the end of the World War I.
So how does that impact this?
That's what I want to add, that the government in Turkey now, or the regime, let me say its government is a too mild word to define it. The regime in Turkey is the most the nationalistic regime that Turkey ever had since the end of the last years of the World War I. So this is very, very, very important in order to understand the modus operandi of today's Turkey. So the foreign policy of such a regime, as we have seen in the historical record, is irredentist, expansionist. In the nice terminology, it's pronounced as assertive. For some, it's aggressive. And so the power structure in Turkey and the domestic political prerequisites this power faces in Turkey reflects in a very active foreign policy with nationalist vistas. But in order to do that, you want to create you have to refer to the imperial legacy and project Turkey not only as a regional power but as a global power. This is the ambition. Whether it is sustainable or not, it's another question. But if you have an ambition to become a global power, then you pursue a foreign policy accordingly. So we see Turkey in Libya, in Syria, in Somalia, in the Gulf, in Qatar, in West Africa, trying or in Sahel, in Africa, trying to encircle France, and in Caucasus, and not reconciling itself to play the second fiddle to Russia, as it was the case in the 2016 or 2017, but to push itself to share Russia, South Caucasus, and we see Iran getting into this equation and trying to create a kind of an Astana mechanism to replace Minsk, instead of the United States, France, and Russia to be the co-chair of the Minsk mechanism, as the Geneva mechanism did not function in Syria, they are now trying to create this kind of a second Astana with Russia, Turkey, and Iran to decide on the fate of South Caucasus.
And in fact, the Minsk group itself is 11 countries that includes Turkey. It's the co-chairs that are those three. So that is something that is part of the OSCE protocol. So we'll see how the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe either does try to include Turkey or tries to distance Turkey. Emil and Cengiz, if you could talk about two sides of the same issue. Emil, how Turkey's involvement, Turkey as big brother, how Turkey is generally perceived in the Azerbaijani media, and how Erdogan's own references to an inclusion of Turkey has changed over time. And Cengiz, how Azerbaijan is perceived in Turkey, in both, again, amongst the public, through the media, and how Erdogan's relationship with Aliyev has changed over time. Emil, you start?
The relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey for a long time has been a very sympathetic one. It's just been distant at the same time. And if we look at the centrality of Turkey in Azerbaijan, it's much more central than Azerbaijan's centrality in Turkey. But what we need to keep in mind is that the particular family that's in charge of Azerbaijan, has been in charge of Azerbaijan for decades, is a very much sort of a post-Soviet family, comes from a sort of Soviet elite, comes from a very liberal, socially liberal mores, kind of not a very good match for Erdogan and
the devout Muslim,
conservative sort of. So there is, on the one hand, there is this sense that Turkey is a big helper for Azerbaijan, but on the other hand, there is a concern, especially among people close to the Aliyev regime or part of the Aliyev regime, that closeness will result in their replacement. They won't be able to hold on, and especially now we have this precedent with Turkish military directly involved and sort of delivering a small victory for Azerbaijan. That changes the domestic equation in
and also the power
substantially.
relationship.
What I would like to maybe shift gears a little bit in this discussion is to try to understand what might be sort of the point of success to which Erdogan is moving here, right? In the case of Syria, if we go back to Syria parallels, for a number of years, Erdogan's point of success was sort of overthrowing Assad regime. That was the announced priority, announced goal. Of course, they had to compromise on that and sort of create this sort of sphere of influence, limited sphere of influence, to keep the Kurdish forces away from the border, etc. at some parts. So that's the compromise, the temporary compromise they came to with Russia as a result of Russian involvement, right? So in this case, we need to see where it is exactly that, are we at the point where, and we already heard from the Turkish General Staff, from Turkish Defense Ministry, that the military success has been achieved, and they've been announcing sort of tactical level advances, etc. But at the same time, we hear from from Çavuşoğlu and from Erdogan that we will not stop until we take all of Karabakh back before Azerbaijan, right? So, but that might be where the position on Assad in Syria, and we need to sort of try to figure out what it is, this point where they can stop on their own, and also we need to figure out whether
stop the military incursion.
Yeah, military incursion. Obviously, the big price they also articulated is that they would be recognized as a mediator or some kind of important country in resolving this Karabakh conflict. And I think Armenia has not been has not looked at this issue at all in any kind of publicly, at least, nuanced way, whether that sort of deference to Turkey, recognition of Turkey's role in this region, might be a price to pay for removing Turkey militarily from Azerbaijan, so, or at least limiting the amount of Turkish military involvement. So I'd like to hear Cengiz's ideas also.
But before Cengiz goes, the one thing I want to add is that for that second step, mediation, if trust is not an element, you don't do mediation holding a stick in your hand. So until that trust issue is resolved and that has just gotten worse instead of better.
The trust will not be there. It's about the fact recognition that Turkey is participating in this conflict. That it's much more directly involved than France or the United States. So it's along the lines against Syria parallels. It's not about Assad or Kurds trusting Erdogan. Obviously, they don't trust him, but they have to kind of participate and appreciate the reality.
So, Cengiz, let's answer Emil's question before mine. If we have time, we'll get to mine. But what is going to be the first marker of some sort of success or accomplishment for Turkey to back off militarily, and then there's the whole second period?
Well, I can't agree more what Emil had said earlier, that given all the maximalist discourse Turkey employs, it even employs in Eastern Mediterranean, but it also it did in Syria, but it also indicated that it can take step backs. Albeit tactically, it can do that. There is this pragmatic area of maneuver for Erdogan. There is a kind of pragmatism also. So Turkey, if there could be some sort of military advances that Aliyev could market domestically, at that point, short of quote-unquote liberating Karabakh and incorporating it into Azerbaijan proper again, short of it. But as I've said, some military successes which could be sold domestically to Azerbaijan, if Turkey is accommodated at a table, at a negotiating table, which will determine strategically the future of the region, beyond even Karabakh, then it will reconcile itself to put the brakes on to the war. So that's why I said that I can't agree more with what Emil said, in the sense that Armenia, it seems, does not look at this very deeply, and obviously there is this element of mistrust, understandably, but this is the crude politics that we are talking about, irrespective of the emotional or the humanitarian aspect of the thing.
And in the long term, is this an entry for Erdogan to also have a bigger impact, role, place in Azerbaijan's leadership, or is that secondary? Is Azerbaijan a part of the calculus here?
I think it's secondary. I heard you saying that there is no kind of a love affair between the two leaders because of the one is a devout Muslim and the other one anything but a devout Muslim. But the power structure in Turkey, as I said, it's nationalist with Muslim toppings on it, which is provided by Erdogan. But the backbone of the power structure in Turkey is nationalist. So in that sense, having Azerbaijan on board and subscribing this motto, one nation, two states, which is in the lips of every Turk and Azerbaijani nowadays, Aliyev can stay as the non-devout Muslim leader of Azerbaijan. It wouldn't be much problem in the minds of Erdogan to replace him by any other kind of regime.
Okay. Last quick question. The Armenians in mostly Istanbul, including the Armenian migrant laborers who are in Istanbul, and the PR efforts, public relations efforts to, if not threaten and endanger them, but certainly to intimidate them. How does that fit into anything?
Is it to me?
Yes, please.
The question. It's very, very difficult to say. One of the things that one never would like to be nowadays, to be an Armenian in Istanbul. Not only an Armenian from Armenia, but Armenians of Istanbul, Armenian citizens of Turkey, that they are in a very unenviable situation I have to admit.
Do you want to open
So
that
it
up just a
will be-
little bit in a minute? How is it different?
Well, you know, with this nationalist frenzy, which is the silencing every sort of opposition in Turkey and sidelining the civil activism for peace, for reconciliation, and which plays good, that nourishes and feeds this nationalist power in a very polarized society, having a deepening economic crisis. So this nationalism is also a good kind of food for the current power in Turkey to feed itself and to be more robust, and victims of one side consolidating its nationalist power is the non-Muslim or non-Turkish minorities, and above anybody else, Armenians. So anything might happen to them, because as far as I recall, the Greek community of Istanbul, Greek community of Turkey, decimated, diminished with the beginning of the Cyprus crisis, first in mid-50s, then in mid-60s, and when this military intervention of Turkey, landing in Cyprus in the year 1974, the huge Greek community of Istanbul in its worst times was over 250,000 people. You can count one by one now. It's less than 2,000 people, and the Armenians in Istanbul altogether, and there are no more Armenians in the Asia Minor, so they are all in Istanbul. It's about 60,000, and I'm not sure if this conflict goes on and on in Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and with the nationalist frenzy that it triggers,
Sure.
and that the Turkish society encapsulates it, that whether it might trigger the migration of the Armenian community of Turkey to abroad. It's plausible, although I don't want it to happen, but to be realistic, it's plausible.
Emil, unless you want to get a last word in, I'm going to say thank you.
No, thank you. Of course, it's an unprecedented situation. I actually remember talking to Cengiz Çandar many years ago about Karabakh problem. I think we were walking through Washington, and I think I still remember that part of that conversation. Turkey's role was key at the origin of this conflict, and sort of this status that Karabakh became an autonomy within Azerbaijan in the early 1920s, and it seems to be still key today. But I think we still, as Armenians, are struggling to articulate a way to talk to Turkey that is, that can, benefit our position in this conflict versus sort of mobilize additional Turkish hostility. So, that was always my concern here, and I think part of the reason Serge Sargsyan engaged in diplomacy with Turkey, and Ter Petrosyan before him engaged in diplomacy with Turkey, is to create this, normalize the relationship. Unfortunately, both failed, and we are where we are right now.
Yeah, the failure was all around. That was at the beginning of the conflict, and I just want to say that as discussions about today's situation evolve, and lots of people say this is a conflict that's going to have repercussions way beyond Armenians and Azerbaijanis. The impact on Armenians in Istanbul is one example. The continuing evolution of relations between Russia and Turkey, a NATO ally, but also more and more involved with Russia in various relationships. All of this is going to just deepen the presence of jihadists and mercenaries in the region. Something that is new is all going to complicate not just the conflict and its resolution, but global relations as if they weren't complicated enough. Next week's conversation is going to be about the conflict at the Armenia border. If you remember, in July in Davush, the attacks on Armenian villages and the fighting that took place between Armenian and Azerbaijani villages across the border, that was a big blip on everybody's radar, and then things quieted down, at least for the global perspective. But for people who live in those immediate areas, the issues, the infrastructure, the water, the safety, all of that still continues. So we'll be talking about that again with the presence of someone from the ground, as well as others who can talk to the issue of development in a state of war, and now, of course, it's a real state of war. I did not formally and properly thank our guests today. Cengiz, Çandar, thank you very much. Professor Robert English, thank you. Anna Arutunyan, thank you. And Emil Sanamyan, always thank you. And we hope to see you again next week. Remind your friends that this discussion is available on YouTube, on Facebook, on the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian website, Institute of Armenian Studies website, and it will be available as an audio podcast on our Unpacking Armenian Studies series. Thank you for following. Thank you for letting us make this a little bit even more complicated in our understanding, because there's no other way to try to get to the end of this. Stay tuned and keep following the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. Thank you.